Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining me. I appreciate you and your organizations and everything that you're doing to keep us healthy and safe. And I know that can be difficult work sometimes in terms of capturing people's attention and getting them to understand what's coming and how we must prepare, and maybe even recognizing what has already happened and doing something about it. And I can identify with that because for a long time, I've been trying to get people to understand what's happening in the name of philanthropy, how it's changing, how certain things are happening that will be very consequential down the road, and trying to get people to understand how consequential they might be. And that issue, the one that I think is of utmost importance that these kinds of meetings should start with, is the decline in philanthropic participation in the United States and indeed across the world. So the number of people giving to institutions and claiming tax credits has been in significant decline for the last 30 years. And so in that period of time, we've lost about 1/3, just speaking of the United States, about 1/3 of the philanthropic public. 1/3 of giving households have stopped giving to institutions. Now, that doesn't mean they've stopped being philanthropic, it doesn't mean they've stopped being good people, but they give less to institutions. And I'm troubled by the fact that while we're all segmented according to our interests, excuse me just a second, that all of us in the business of fundraising from philanthropic households don't find common cause in this decline. It's affecting us all. The number of nonprofits continues to grow while the number of contributing households continues to shrink. This doesn't look good, does it, as more of us become dependent on fewer giving households? And it's particularly troubling is because it isn't as if we're trying to talk people into giving. What we've seen is that giving people have become frustrated with institutions and decided to act on their own agency, to give to friends, to family, to give to neighbors, to respond to crowdfunding appeals, and to not be concerned about the tax credits. That's why we lose of them. But so they don't care whether you're a 501c3 or not. What they want to do is to act on their values and to make a difference. And they've become discouraged by either giving to or giving through institutions, maybe feeling as if they don't understand the impact of their giving, which is the principal concern our research shows, maybe feeling there's too much red tape, which other research shows to be a critical issue, and maybe even feeling that some of those institutions have become bloated, detached, removed, too much about themselves, and having moved away from where American philanthropy started, which was we the people, acting in community, driven by common cause and common concern, trying to create a better world for ourselves and for our children and grandchildren. That somehow institutions aren't quite with us, aren't quite speaking our language. So think about a gap that's growing between what institutions want from their donors and what donors want from their institutions. And as that gap grows and mistrust accrues and concern accrues, it becomes harder and harder to bring people back. And the more time that elapses, the more difficult it is to bring people back. So we tend to be so obsessed about dollars, particularly dollars raised in any given year, we don't step back often enough and look at donors. And the simple fact of the matter is the vast, vast majority of institutions have shown greater increases in dollar amounts or level of funding while they have seen a decline in donors. So as long as the dollars held up, they thought, well, that's fine. But what's going on there is the dollars are being held up by fewer, older donors of a generation who were more inclined to trust institutions and to adhere to institutions over the course of their lifetime. As they age, we're not particularly well prepared to look at and manage the transition. So as I look at the faces before me, I can see a number of not just baby boomers, but some millennials in this group. And your peer group is the most mistrustful of institutions, the most likely to stipulate that they won't give until they're brought inside as a volunteer, until they can see and hear and feel for themselves. They're not going to take your pitches. They're not going to take your appeals, even though they may be concerned about the environment. Life has taught them to dig a little deeper, to pay a little bit more attention, to do more due diligence, so that when they give, they have some assurance, their voice is heard, they matter, they belong, they know the people who are expending the money, and therefore have some greater assurance that they can make a difference. So there we go, is so much of fundraising seems geared to trusting baby boomers and so little to adapting to new realities. So if you see a decline in the number of giving households, it suggests, does it not, three broad strategies. One, we must redouble our efforts to keep the donors we have. Donors are trees. If trees are nurtured, they bear this fruit called giving. If we lose trees, we lose the fruit. So we want to look at and say, are we preserving these trees over time? So one metric then emerges as more important than all others, not dollars, but donors. And not just the raw number of donors, but how many donors are we retaining from year to year? When do we lose most donors? After the first gift. People make one gift and fall away. Why? Because we attempt to reacquire them in the same way we acquired them the first time, and we don't do anything in the intervening year to make them feel as if they matter, they belong, or to better understand the impact they've had. We send them the same literature, and we simply treat them as if, you know, they've given a gift, but there's no, in most cases, direct outreach, more direct engagement, conversation, interview. And so after the first year, they turn over, I gave, I'm not sure what happened. And they may even be stolen away by organizations that simply did a better job of following up. So I gave a gift, for instance. This was a few years ago. You remember in, I believe it was Pennsylvania, where a number of households blew up because there was a malfunction in the gas main. And all of a sudden, a number of homes burst into fire. And, you know, obviously very disturbing. I was traveling at the time and I was in that neighborhood. I believe it was near Philadelphia. And I went out to eat. And in the back room of the restaurant, I saw a group of neighbors trying to organize a relief for those poor people whose homes erupted in flames because their gas lines malfunctioned and their furnaces turned into igniters, not warmers of their houses. And so I gave them a nice gift, I think $1,000. I wrote a check that night. And when I was in the car the following day, I got a call from a board member saying, thank you, board member of the Westchester Community Foundation that was receiving, saying, thank you, that was wonderful you gave, we noticed, why did you give, and how can we keep you informed? You see, what they did was to notice a first-time gift, to have intervening strategies, and even though they may have been very lean, they at least had a group of volunteers who recognized and had been trained, this is important. So somebody's bouncing around there. So, all right, I'm going to move my screen a little bit there. I keep seeing somebody jump up and down. So they are, you see what happened is somebody was wise enough to know we captured a significant donor. Let's let him know we know, and let's see what we can do to make him feel a part of this community. So we have to then say, what are we doing to redouble our efforts to keep the donors we have? We've got to stem further donor attrition. So how do we do that? We simply don't take people for granted, and anything we can do to ask them why they gave will allow us to play back messages to them that will resonate with their personal experience. So little simple things, a 2-minute interview, a quick telephone call to a first-time donor of any magnitude can cement and cause a person to stay another year. And with every passing year, then we deepen affinity. And I hope everyone knows that most significant gifts, whether it's $100,000 or $1 million gift, come from the most loyal donors. And the most productive pipeline we have are gifts who come from people who have given 15 years or more. In other words, we tend to give our largest gift to the institutions we've been loyal to for 15 years or more. We tend to give the largest or give estate gifts and the largest estate gifts to organizations we've been loyal to for 20 years or more. So you see all this focus on cash this year, as opposed to relationships sustained over time, puts us in the hunt for cash constantly. As donors turn over, there we are again, scrambling for cash. But if we nurture and retain donors, we create this predictable portion of giving that serves as a living endowment. And with living endowments, we don't have to scramble as much over time. We just nurture relationships. But I know the pressure is often on us simply to produce dollars each year, and there's not as much of an imperative to retain donors. So job number one is to try to educate everyone within, including ourselves, is in the face of these new realities, in the face of these new realities, can we be more mindful of donor retention, right? And so job one, and then thinking about every possible way to keep donors cost-effective, little simple ways, making people feel as if they make a difference. The second strategy that emerges is if we then are going to have a limited number of donors, simply because the pool of donors continues to shrink, because we've lost trust in institutions or we've decided to be philanthropic on our own, is what can we do to lift the sights of donors? Not by asking them for more money, but by helping them understand differences made. So our research shows that donors feel more than adequately thanked by the organizations they give to, but underinformed as to the impact of their giving. So we keep thanking them, as if we thank them more often, it will cement their loyalty, and it doesn't hurt. It's a nice thing to do. But they keep saying, but did I make a difference? What difference did I make? So when we see organizations equating gifts to outcomes, like your gift allowed us to stock the shelves in a food bank for 3 months. Your gift allowed us to adopt 3 more or rescue 3 more dogs. Your gift allowed us to dig a well in Africa. You see where I'm going? Versus thank you for that gift. What smart organizations are doing are saying gifts of certain magnitude relate to certain impacts and outcomes, which is really what people are looking for. I could give to multiple organizations. The person who gives to 4.5 organizations and will gravitate and give more to the organizations where they feel they've made the biggest impact according to their values. So your donors may be giving to multiple organizations that deal with environmental issues, but increasingly favor those that listen to them, that make them feel as if they belong, and most importantly, show them how the monies they've given have made concrete differences. So that's the second strategy, is what I'll call sight lifting. But it isn't by saying, hey, you gave $500 last year, why don't you give 1,000? It is saying, do you understand what that $500 did incrementally, why it's so important? And if we multiply 500 times 25, that's the equivalent of what you're doing. It's the endowment equivalent. In other words, you're giving annually the equivalent of an endowment worth 25 times more. You're a living endowment. As long as you stay with us, you're giving us the equivalent of an endowment payment. You see what you're saying is, don't think it's too modest. Realize you're a living endowment, and that is dependable source of giving that allows us to plan, to think carefully about what we're doing, to rely on people who are loyal to us. The other incredibly important thing to do is to notice years of loyalty. So if I've been loyal to you for 4 years and I give my 5th gift, and you don't notice, isn't that like any relationship where we just had our 5th anniversary and our partners don't notice? Don't forget, I mean, we'll forget to you see? So certain anniversary years are incredibly important. One of the things that I did in my career that was now considered an innovation was really based on research done by Penelope Burke. And this was 35 years ago, in which Penelope Burke, Canadian researcher looking at both Canadian and American philanthropy, said, the most important thing you can do to loyal donors is to keep playing their records back to them. So every year, send them their collective record of giving. Here's what you have done for us. We notice this is the difference you're making. Now, this scares some people for some reason, or they think it's going to cause people to say, well, if I've given you that much, why do you keep asking me for more? But Penelope Burke says they're value-driven investors. And if you respond to value-driven investors by saying, we appreciate your record and appreciate this deepening relationship, they feel that they're in a relationship with you. So I was working for a university at the time. I read it, and we sent out 1,000 records to our top 1,000 donors, 1,000 records of giving. And what happened within a matter of days, which was quite astonishing, was they wrote or called us and said, thank you so much. No one's ever done this before. It's so nice to know that you are recognizing, kind of keeping a record of loyalty. But I see I missed 1989. I didn't realize I did. My wife was ill. Can I buy it back? The loyal donor was so loyal to the cause, the purpose, that they actually wanted an unbroken record. And I did this decades later with another institution with the same result. Of the 1,000 records issued, over 300 donors saw and said, can I buy back the years I've missed? Loyalty to that cause was so important to them. So the reinforcement of loyalty is incredibly important, and holding up people's records in a customized way to them is incredibly important. And having something like a loyalty society, or having you or your leaders speak to the value of loyalty, is moving to loyal people. I will acknowledge that most of them are of older generations, but some of them are still going to be with us for decades, and you can cement ties with them by saying, we notice your loyalty, we count your loyalty, and we want to celebrate your loyalty. If you go back to having events in person and you have donors coming to it, imagine the power of your CEO being able to say, I hope you notice that there's a red sash around the first 2 rows to my right, and I want you to know that these are donors who have given 10 years or more. Will they stand and be recognized? What you are doing is solidifying loyalty, building community, and showing it's not just about chasing dollars, but building community. So let's just recap a couple of points here. One broad strategy is to husband the donors we have by obsessing about any donor attrition, by getting smarter and smarter about why we're losing donors, and trying to react to first-time gifts as quickly as we can. The second is to lift the sights of donors that we have by recognizing loyalty and by demonstrating impact in more concrete ways, okay? The third strategy that we must look at to become more effective then is, what do we learn from the donors we've lost? Are we actually looking at lapsed donors after a year or two and pursuing them and saying, what can we learn? In other words, calls or outreach to say, what can we learn? We noticed that you were supportive of us and we seem to have lost you. In some cases, people go, oh my, I may have changed my computer, didn't realize I dropped you off my giving list, so when I make my commitments in December, I may have missed you, or they may tell you why. So we have to learn, like all successful organizations, I have to learn what happens if I lose a client, if I'm going to be a good consultant and a good trainer. We just can't, again, say, well, dollars, dollars, dollars. in a world where we're all losing donors, what do we learn from it? Maybe people say, I didn't feel heard, I didn't feel valued, I didn't feel my gift made a difference because it was so modest. This is what we hear over and over again. My gift was so modest. Well, $500 is not modest, and sometimes the giver of a $500 gift is financially capable of more, but feels inconsequential. So, you're trying to nurture people's feelings and say, no, you matter, you matter. Here's what that money means to us, right? So are we actually monitoring donor attrition and moving in? And the sad fact of the matter is, if we don't do it within 2 years, we tend to lose those donors forever. And when you lose a donor, you don't get them back. So in a world of contracting donors and more contraction coming, are you sure you want to do things that cause donors to be lost forever, right? So what is that we're doing? Here we are in an environment talking about saving the precious natural resources we have. And what am I doing? Arguing for that we save the precious human resources we have by being environmentally astute about what's going on. It's the same set of principles you're talking about that I'm talking about in the environment of philanthropy. The other thing we have to learn more about, and there's now a story in I think last week's issue of the Chronicle of Philanthropy, which is, did we lose donors, or did they go off the institutional grid and just start giving on their own? And that's what that article is about, is no, they're still kind, loving, and philanthropic, but they're doing things like putting their grandchildren through college. They don't get a tax credit for it, but it certainly is benevolent and helpful and what we would consider philanthropic. They may be giving money to neighbors directly who are hard hit. They may be responding to crowdfunding about people needing operations for which they can't entirely pay. They may be just acting in community. They may be really generous tippers. During COVID, when so many restaurants were struggling, many people were ordering food out or pickup and giving twice the amount that they were being billed, knowing those restaurants were struggling. When the restaurants started to open sidewalk ways of serving the public, we heard from wait staff that some were receiving extraordinary tips well above the average for the cost of the meal. Why? People knew they were struggling, knew that was part of their livelihood, and just literally, in the name of tips, were giving them support for trying and knowing that these were difficult times. So you see, that's philanthropic. But what the people who are now giving interpersonally, who once gave to institutions, say why they stopped giving to institutions: too much red tape, too hard to give, too many stipulations, too many calls, too many urgings, too being hounded, just wasn't a pleasant experience. And second, didn't know the impact of my giving, couldn't tell if I made a difference, wasn't sure if I made a difference. So now I get the joy of seeing who I can help, knowing what I can do, and now feeling I'm making a difference. So what is it that we could do in the name of crowdfunding, in the name of interpersonal interactions, in terms of showing people differences made, not just telling them differences made, that would bring back those people who've gone off the grid? They're philanthropic, they care, they want to help. They're maybe even local in the way they give. How do we bring them back into the funding mix by doing the very things that make them feel good about their giving? And then finally, while it's not a broad strategy, is to make sure, and I don't know you well enough, that we're not engaged in fundraising strategies that are simply off-putting. And those strategies that are off-putting, that donors find either not attractive to begin with, or ultimately cause them to lose heart, would be things like whining, crying poor us, right? We don't have enough money, as opposed to imagine what we could do. You see the difference between we don't have enough versus if we had more, we could do more. One saying we intend to do more, the other just makes it about us. about asking for unrestricted without saying we just need money for us and let us determine how it's used, and making too many calls, saying the same thing, or too many appeals. Research, not only ours, but many other people's research show this is off-putting. The donor doesn't want to be harangued, the donor wants to be informed, and the donor doesn't want to hear a tale of woe. They want to hear, if you had more, what you could do. They don't want to subsidize your operation. They want to give you to improve your agency. And some people think it's an either or. Well, you can put the cost of operations into other funds raised, but you just don't go around to people saying, we need new computers, or we need this or that or the other. You build that in to the estimates you make of the impacts you can have. So we've somehow come up with this notion that we have to tell donors we have operational needs, and that's how we get operational needs met, versus telling donors what we could do with more money that would include operational costs. And I hope that makes sense. So pleading, begging, crying poor is not a helpful fundraising strategy, and actually damaging to your credibility over time. You may mean well, but you see, it's like the person who keeps seeing homeless people and maybe giving them a few bucks and then concluding this isn't working because I'm seeing more homeless people. But what I need to do now is to find organizations that address the structural reasons for homelessness and give them money so that we can mitigate this problem. I want to invest going forward, not just remediate an issue right now, and particularly an operational expense issue, right? Because I'm cause oriented. All right, so I wanted to lay out those broad strategies. Any questions, comments, debates, anything at this point? Because then we can start talking about optimizing in some of those areas, like interviews you conduct, questions you can ask that will start causing people to feel valued and bring important information to you about how to strengthen relationships. So let me just open it up and see if we have questions, comments, concerns from anybody, or anybody wanting a clarification on anything I said.
I do have a question. Oh,
sure.
Sorry, Deborah, you can go first.
That's okay. Go ahead.
I was just wondering whether your research shows the ideal number of appeals per year.
So here's the problem is when are people receptive to appeals? So a few years ago, before some organizations sort of moved loyal donors to their fiscal year, 90% of people who gave annually gave when? December. We were in the habit of saying before the end of the year, let's make that decision, because that was a part of our tax calculations, right? So we would be loyal to an organization. We would listen to appeals, maybe even take those appeals and put them in our files. And then when it came simply to streamline our processes, we would then make those gifts in December. 90% of us did that. Now, every once in a while, somebody would be moved by an appeal that they came across and make a commitment then. But once they liked that organization, they'd lock it into that annual habit. So then somebody got the funny notion that the more appeals you make, the more likely people are to give. And so this theory emerged of 6 or 7 appeals would increase giving, but no one looked at when the 6th or 7th appeal was made, which was usually November or December, toward the end of the calendar year. So they made a false assumption that more appeals led to more giving, as opposed to the later in the year the appeal is made, the more likely it is to produce a gift. You see, that's a classic mistake in misinterpreting data, correlation and causation. So what you want to do is look at people's giving habits. One of the things, if you can, is to keep track of when do your commitments come in, and then how do you reinforce them? So it's not the number of appeals, but it may be the number of interactions. So we want to do more appeals when all our research says, no, what you want is more conversations. And what you want is 4 outreaches to donors every year in which you ask 2 or 3 questions. And then toward the end of the year, make the appeal, November, December, and you'll see a much stronger harvest as a result. But if you appeal, the research shows you drive down. And that while we've said, because we think the number of appeals has made a difference, there's research, including that done by Penelope Burke, who I cited earlier, who says after 5 appeals, you then tend to be seen as a nuisance and lose donors who think you're spending too much money on appeals themselves. And you're assuming that repetition is what they need to be convinced, as opposed to statements of impact or listening exercises. So you see how we got into the business of thinking certain things on false misreading of evidence and mishearing or not hearing what donors were trying to tell us when they fell away.
Thank you.
Make sense?
Yes.
I was so struck. I went to a conference and somebody said 6 appeals, and I said, when's the 6th appeal? And she said, December. And I said, do you see the difference? It's when people are ready to give. So if you don't, I know Lauren does, and I'm very grateful. She follows me on LinkedIn. So one of the things I did was I posted to help small, because I get a lot of people asking me to help, and I can't help everybody. I don't have enough time in the day, and some of you can't afford me. So I post things on LinkedIn to help smaller organizations. And one of the things I posted a couple of months ago is think about retaining donors by asking 3 questions, either interpersonally on the phone or simply pushing out an email. 3 questions each quarter, so that when you come time to making the appeal in the 4th quarter, you've really seeded the ground in a very positive way that greatly increases the likelihood they're giving. And we can talk about those now if you'd like, but I'd also encourage you to look up those resources to know that I do that, and other people in this world are doing that, because we believe in small grassroots nonprofits, but don't have time to help you all, and know that you can't always afford people like us. Okay. All right. What else? Anything else on your mind?
I have a question just about red tape.
Yeah.
Do you have solutions? You know, what makes giving the easiest? I mean, what do you think people think is the easiest?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if it's easy to give, you don't have to fill out a lot of forms. You don't have to be, get a lot of complication in the process. So some people have incredible sort of pledge forms. Even talking about, if you don't fulfill your pledge, will your estate take care of it? They get the wrong people in charge of gift processing, and they turn it into a bureaucratic nightmare. As opposed to an Amazon approach, where you can push a couple of buttons and get the job done. Some want to capture so much biographical information about you that you have to be interviewed before you can make a gift, because then they want to build out their records. Not, they overdo it. I understand why people do what they do, but they overdo it, right? And so these are all, off-putting things, or it takes them a long time to get a receipt or acknowledgement, or the information they get sounds bureaucratic to them. It doesn't sound like impact oriented. It just sounds like, I don't know, a governmental report talking about why you should be impressed with us, as opposed to, and why we're the heroes in the story, as opposed to why you are invaluable to us. It's an interesting phenomenon we've discovered earlier, is somebody's done some really interesting work and said what's really happening is organizations try to make themselves the heroes and turn donors into adoring acolytes. We're so proud of you, as opposed to treasuring the donor for their selflessness in taking their hard-earned money and allocating it for good cause. Isn't that interesting?
It is interesting.
Who's
But
the
yet,
hero in
isn't
the
that
story?
part of the impact though? Like we're touting, what we've done, to let them know the impact their dollars made. Isn't that kind of the same thing?
It could be, if you tie it to them being part of the equation.
Okay.
So again, these are great questions. keep them coming, but let me push back. In your annual reports and in your fundraising reports, what's the first thing you lead with? Impacts made or dollars raised? In your reports, do you talk about donors preserved and donor stories or dollars? So much of what they're seeing is dollars, dollars, dollars. Well, who are those dollars coming from, they may wonder. And why doesn't that factor into the equation? Without you. And the other thing that so many nonprofits say, quite startling to me, is we raised, not you gave.
Okay.
We raised it. Well, as a donor, and I bet all of you are donors, I was a donor well before you came onto the scene. I made myself philanthropic and then decided which causes to give to. You didn't make me philanthropic and you didn't cause me to give. I reviewed my choices and chose you. You're overstating your part in the equation. I know that's going to be rankling to some people, but you're talking to a man who raised money for 30 years as a frontline fundraiser. I never made anybody philanthropic who wasn't previously philanthropic. I worked with the philanthropic to show where their investments were best placed. I didn't take credit for their goodness. I did take credit for working with them to find the best way to bring out their goodness. Want to push back? Anybody? Making anybody mad? I'm provocative.
No, but I have a couple questions.
Please, go. We should debate. This is all part of the.
First, I'm just interested to know whether the decline in institutional giving, does institutions, does that include religious organizations?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So
and here's what's interesting when you think about the environment is that's a big, and universities, right? Because of debt-saddled alumni, really questioning whether that's was a productive affiliation and why should they give back when they're still paying off debt. But we've become less religious. So when you looked at who gave to all causes and purposes, the religious people gave more not only to religion, but to all causes and purposes, because religion taught a selflessness, taught there was something greater than ourselves, that we had obligations to things greater than ourselves. Now, just like what I described before, as people aren't becoming less philanthropic, it appears they're becoming less explicitly religious in a denominational sense, but not less spiritual, not less seeking community and meaning in lives. And when you look at something like environment, they can become religious about the environment, right? So in other words, strongly held values which then drive behavior is religious behavior. Strongly held values upon which we never act in terms of time, talent, and treasure isn't really a strongly held value. The religious both believe and give of self in the pursuit of those beliefs. So you see religiosity in strong causes like the environment. Make sense?
very, very, very much.
And then you got to feed that religiosity. You got to feed that with something more than we raised and look at the dollars. And, aren't you proud of us as look what we, the people, we in congregation together achieved. Just like imagine the minister standing up and saying, I got you folks to give last year, and therefore we were able to perform these services because I'm such a convincing preacher. I don't think the congregation would quite enjoy that. I'm sorry, I know I'm provocative. All right, so what I'm going to try to do now is to share the screen and talk about some of these questions and refer you to this LinkedIn site. What's good fundraising about is emotional intelligence. And what are emotionally intelligent people good at? Relationships, intuiting what the other thinks, picking up on, valuing the other, and intuiting the other. Oh, I think somebody's feelings are hurt even though they're not quite saying it. I may have stepped on their toes. They may feel slighted. They may feel ignored. And so sometimes I look at what institutions are doing that's quite noble in terms of their mission, but I go, where's the emotional intelligence in that organization? Where's this picking up on how other people might think about that. All right. So when you're doing donor strategies, when you're doing stewardship, when you're doing listening exercises, we need to seek out really emotionally intelligent people. And sometimes we'll know them by how many good relationships they have. Right? They're just the kind of people who just are really good about building and sustaining relationships. They make people feel valued and they make people feel as if they matter. They just do this interpersonally. And then go to them and say, help us do these things, because good institutional relationships are nothing more than good human relationships made large. Do we brag to our partners about how good we are? Do we talk all the time, or do we listen? Do we try to wow them into doing what we want, or do we collaborate with them to do things we want to do together, right? Look at all the things that institutions do to try to get people to do things, and look at good relationships, how we negotiate what we do together. There's something missing in this institutional thinking that gets a little misses the very thing that works in interpersonal relationships. Somehow we got to crack the code. Maybe you already are, but we got to start importing more talent in this area than we have. Now, can people see this?
Yes.
All right, the LinkedIn. So just give you a second to read the paragraphs, and then I'll run down and show you what the questions are per quarter. I don't feel the need to read things to you, so give you just a minute here. I want to respect slow readers, because slow readers are often deep thinkers. They're really ingesting the information. Okay, I'm going to move up so you can start seeing specific questions that can be asked. So you've acquired a donor for the first gift, and the first thing you want to ask are those first question quarters. I mean, first quarter questions, right? Now, I hope, and again, feel free to quarrel with me, to push back. You see how that immediately makes an impression on a donor and starts to give you a philanthropic biography? Who did we acquire? What did they care about? What was the cause of it? But also, questions like this make people feel respected. When we do interviews, and I've done lots of what I'll call forensic listening exercises, what do we hear most often? I never felt more respected. This is so nice to be treated to this interview, right? It's the way we listen that also affords people respect and makes them feel as if they matter. And one of the questions in the chat room is, how do you ask? Any way you can ask is better than no way. And the more interpersonal it can be, in person or on a Zoom or equivalent, is better than a phone call. But if for economic reasons you need to do it by email, by letter, by whatever, do it. But if we can see each other, the best interviews, it comes from an old French word meaning to see one another. Interview. Entrevue. To see one another. See, that's what we do in good relationships, is we see one another and what we have in common. We see a dynamic. We see the jointness, the mutuality of our relationship. So anything we can do there will make a difference. And I also want you to see the progressiveness in these questions. Second quarter, stewardship. How are you feeling? How did we do after that first gift? Checking in. What might we have missed? 3 questions each quarter. What's it take? A couple minutes? Get your volunteers to do it. Get your board members to do it. Get anybody who says, I want to help this cause more to do it, because you're going to attract a lot of people with social science backgrounds who don't have to be extroverts. Really good interviewers are not extroverts. They're curious people who listen carefully. And by the way, that's true of gift officers as well. A great myth is that they're extroverted. They're somewhere between introvert and extrovert, the best ones. All right, now third quarter, now we're halfway through the year. As a consultant, you travel a lot, not so much in the last year and a half, but it's picking up again. But when I traveled a lot, I would use different hotel chains, and they would send me surveys afterwards because they wanted to keep the business travelers. They wanted to retain us, right? So they'd send us these surveys, and some of them were onerous. They would take 10 minutes and they'd ask you, was the bed nice? Was the bathroom clean? Et cetera, et cetera. And going, wow, was the mattress firm enough? It's like, wow, tactical questions. And one hotel chain, Kimpton, if you've heard of them, asked 3 questions. Were you made to feel welcome when you arrived? Were you made to feel comfortable in the room? And were you made to feel important in the way we treated you while you stayed? You see, they weren't after the tactics, they were after attachment, the human connection. Then imagine if you've done this by the time the fourth quarter comes along and precedes the appeal, of which you may have done 0, scary to so many organizations, and you ask these questions and you've checked the boxes and made sure that people are feeling good about where they are. Then you send the appeal, watch what happens. If you mistrust my advice, divide your donors in half, appeal to one as many as you want, and appeal to the others as few as you can, and use these approaches, and you tell me how you did at the end of the year. Run experiments. So you see the difference, right? Questions go from you gave, and here's what we're doing with it, to building community, sustaining loyalty, making people feel as they matter, belong, and doing all you can to ensure that they give again. And the more of this we do, the more we retain donors, the more we build communities of shared concern and shared purpose. And the more of that we do, the more everything goes up, right? The more everything goes up, and the less desperate we are from year to year to scramble around and get money. All right, let me pause again. I'm checking the chat room, but begging any questions or concerns or debates,
I have another one.
please.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier about recognizing donors in annual reports. And I'm wondering, I know that, years back, we used to do, and organizations I worked for would do these big glossy annual reports, and they'd try to name every donor, and they'd segment it by, 10,000 and above and 5,000 and above. And I'm seeing, very much less of that now. Annual reports at all, or annual reports for donors are listed with dollar amounts, which I always was a little uncomfortable with.
Yes.
I'm wondering what your views are on the value of, certainly you mentioned a different way of trying to acknowledge the donor in the annual report, but I'd just like to hear your thoughts in general on.
Yes. So what people learned, what we all learned, was those honor rolls where you just set out something that looked like a tombstone with everybody's name listed on it and dollar amounts, or a war memorial. The only people didn't read them except to see if you got their name and number right. So they weren't effective, except they could backfire if the material was wrong or you admitted somebody. So it caused a problem, not didn't lift anybody's sights, versus the way I suggested was, particularly to loyal donors, you can't do it for donors who have just given for a year or two, but send customized reports, and then donor stories in an annual report, not the listing or enumeration of gifts, and certainly not the societies don't do anything by and large, to motivate people to give a little bit, but they're not persuasive in and of themselves. So the smartest thing you can do is to put out reports with donor stories, particularly why they gave and why it was so rewarding to them. So for instance, I've done work for land associations, land preservations, and my research. So they come in, and my first instinct was, well, people who give to those do so because they've lived in one area all their lives and they want to keep it beautiful, right? They don't want to lose the home and the beauty of their natural surroundings. Well, that's part of it. But the more deeply motivated donor was one who grew up in a beautiful place and saw it spoiled by overdevelopment, then moved and said, I'm never going to let that happen again. So if you're going to do an annual report from a land association or land preservation group, what story you're going to tell is the story of a person giving or preserving the land, right? Giving a significant tract of land, and the story of why, because it resonates with so many other donors, and you start to get cross communication among donors. Well, that's how I feel. That's exactly, where did you grow up? I grew up here. You see, and Penelope Burke said this a long time ago, is you want to start introducing donors to one another so they feel like they're among kindred spirits. It's not a fellow donor, but it's a donor motivated in the same way I'm motivated, caring in the same way, and cause to give for something. So when you have donor events, you see, we start talking about things we shared, heartbreaking memories of lost childhood places, right? So that makes people feel in community with fellow donors. So not only am I giving to an organization I admire and respect, and not only am I feeling better about the impact, but when I go to donor events, I'm among kindred spirits who share my feelings and share my experiences. Therefore, if I don't know somebody at a table, at least I know what brings us together. There's that emotional intelligence coming in, is introduce people according to what brings them together. I've worked with researchers all my life and faculty members who tend to talk at a very intellectual level, but I noticed people gave at a very, reasons they gave were very personal to them. So if I saw somebody give to, let's say, cardiovascular care, very generously, very significantly, I knew it affected them or had affected someone in their family, that somebody or generations, right? So, invariably I could go to them and say, that was wonderful. You were so generous. Why did you tell me why you did that? And, I'd always hear stories about, my father was really physically fit and dropped dead of a heart attack when he was 42, or everybody, or, 80% of people in my family have cardiovascular disease. Then I went over to the researchers who were making their names in cardiovascular care. And I said, why did you get into cardiovascular research? And they said, well, I lost my father. He was really physically fit when he was 48. I went, oh my goodness. Here we are telling them what great researchers you are. What I need to do is start telling them they're motivated by the same things you are. And when you meet with them, you may be in awe about how smart they are, but no, there's a human being there who gets up in the morning and strives to do something about this issue for something that's very similar to the reason that you give. You see what you're doing? Kindred spirits, common cause. You're introducing people according to animating passions and driving concerns. That makes us feel part of one. Anything else? We got just a few minutes left. Anything really pressing? Please do follow me on LinkedIn, comment, including what you like and don't like. I keep trying to learn and try to better serve. And you'll see I try to be provocative because we're relying on bad data and false assumptions. And people go to fundraising conferences or talk to fellow fundraisers, and they start replicating the things. They just fall in. We all say we raise. For most of my career, I said I raised until it was like, Jim, you see what you did? You fell into a trap because everybody's saying the same thing. You fell into a trap. I just started to say, I'm not going to say anything publicly that isn't, or do anything privately that's at a donor's expense. And I'm going to try to say everything publicly that ennobles philanthropy, that shows I treasure philanthropy, and shows that I put the donor first, including above my ego, my credentials, or what I want people to think about me. Without them, I wouldn't have had a career. So Lauren is nice enough to call me donor centric. I actually say donor first, but mission centric. And we can't advance missions without putting donors first. And
James, I have a quick question. Do
please,
you
please.
have an example of a company, when you're talking about the annual reports and just like a nice way to put donors in there with maybe not being so specific? I mean, is there any company that you would recommend that we should look at?
You know who does a better job of that? And I check in with her from time to time is Lynn Wester. Does everybody follow her?
Yep.
Donor guru. Because she'll cite and she'll hold up. And so I'll check in with her. I can think of clients, but I think she could probably give you more of a pattern and examples of people who are doing that well. And I've even, sort of nudged my own clients when they'll show me drafted reports. I'll go, wait a minute. Show, don't tell. And celebrate, philanthropy itself, and then differences made, and then cite donor stories that you think others will resonate with. So I can think of a number. I just don't want to favor or disfavor some, but I think Lynn does a good job of drawing our attention to sort of best practice in that area.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. Or I could just send Lauren something if I come upon it and say, please share it with the group. I could certainly show you what I think is terrible practice. Well, we only have a minute left, but maybe I'll send it to Lauren of my favorite terrible cover on an annual report. How's that for a closer?
Okay, thank you.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much for what you do. You're probably all underpaid, underloved, and yet you're trying to save our hides and create better worlds for us and our children. So thank you so much for what you do, and I hope you find psychic rewards in the good people you're dealing with and the differences you're making.
Appreciate you joining us, Jim, today and sharing all of your
Thank you.
expertise.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much.
All the best to you all.
And
Bye-bye.
you.
Thanks, Jim.
You
Thank you
bet.
so much. I learned a lot.
I hope so. I'll try. Take care.